I want to take you on a little journey. I want to tell you a couple stories, and I hope that you'll come along with me. I was walking through my office one day on the way to get a cup of coffee, and I happened to pass by Mike, an older associate, talking to David, a much younger gentleman, about 30 years younger. And I was paused in my tracks when I heard Mike say that he had run a 10K race that weekend. Okay, soft-spoken, gravelly voice. I didn't picture Mike as much of a runner. I thought he had probably had a little bit of a hard life, but I'd never bothered to ask him. So I continued to make my cup of coffee and eavesdrop, and I heard him tell David that he had run 20 10Ks, 15 5Ks, and he was training for a half marathon. Okay, more tortoise than hare. I'm telling you the truth. He worked in our cleaning department, 20 feet long, 5 feet deep. He didn't have to move very far or very fast to provide the really good customer service that he was known for. And in this moment, I start hearing my grandmother. You can tell me if you have a grandmother like this. She used to say, "Don't be nosy." A conversation with grandma might start and stop like this. What's your middle name? Don't be nosy. I never got anywhere asking that woman any questions. And as a result, I would walk into meetings like this and I would panic because I wouldn't know how to talk to any of you. And what do you do if you can't make connections? So David gets tired of listening to Mike talk about his running prowess, and he says, "I'm going to go back out to work." And that is my cue. I finish making that cup of coffee, I sidle on over, and I start to pepper Mike with questions of my own. Like, "Hey, Mike, have you been running your whole life? That's a seriously impressive resume." And he said, "No, I just started running 4 years ago." 4 years ago, Mike was 59 years old. Now, I know 59-year-olds that jump out of airplanes, climb Mount Everest. My mom went parasailing at 75 this year. But I just didn't see Mike as a runner. So I said, "Hey, Mike, why did you become a runner at 59? What was it about your life?" There was a long, dramatic pause. And Mike looked down at his feet. And he looked back up and he said, "I was homeless, Gina. I was living on a park bench in the middle of Washington, D.C. I had lived on that same bench for years. Winter was coming, my feet were cold, and a man from a nonprofit organization came to me and he said, 'Hey, if you come to our meeting, we'll give you a pair of shoes.' I didn't have anything else to do, so I went to the meeting. And I got to that meeting and they said, 'Hey, if you come to another meeting, we'll give you a pair of pants.' So I went to that meeting too. And at that third meeting, they said, 'Hey, do you want to go for a walk with us?' And he had this look of pride in his face, and I remember thinking, I'm so glad that I asked him to tell me this story. And he said, 'I walked my way to being a jogger, and I jogged my way to being a runner. And then I started running all over Washington, D.C. And I am in my head, jumping up and down. I do this quite a bit, high-fiving people around me, trying not to act like a fool. So I was so glad that I asked his story. And I went back to my office, and I was doing the office-y things I had to do that day. And it finally dawned on me the real message in that story. Mike not only ran himself around Washington, D.C., he ran himself to an apartment. He wasn't homeless anymore. He ran himself to a company with teammates and customers that adore him, a 401k, a healthcare plan. And you know what else he did? He ran himself to being an owner in a brand new 2-year-old ESOP. Yeah, don't you all want to clap for Mike? Yeah. I love telling Mike's story. Businesses keep score with money, but business isn't just about money. It's about people. It's about building a place where we want to be and grow and stay. But I used the word score, and we all score with numbers. Do not ask me about the Broncos football game last week. We keep score with numbers. That's what good businesses do. All of you report out to your shareholders their value in the ESOP. Those are the metrics we use. But what do you do with somebody like Mike? How do you put Mike in a tidy little box on an Excel spreadsheet? What do you do? Years ago, when I was still in the tech industry, I had a title, my favorite title I've ever had in my life. It was Manager of Intangible Assets. Right there in the middle was this word intangible. Intangible did not mean unimportant or uninteresting. It meant people. My responsibility at that company was employee satisfaction, number one. Now, let's go back to that spreadsheet. I could send out satisfaction surveys. Many of you probably do that, right? Good companies do that. And I could have done it on a weekly basis or a monthly basis, whatever cadence that my bosses were looking for. But my job was to create stories, to find the lore, cultivate the curiosity among the team. I always laugh when I think of this piece. By the time I left that company, 14 couples, meaning 28 employees, got married. 14 and 34 are numbers that we can put. I did that math completely wrong, didn't I? 14 couples got married. I could have put those numbers in an Excel spreadsheet. It would have been tidy. But let me tell you, we had some stories. We had lots of things we could talk about why those employees wanted to work there, how they were growing, how they were helping us grow the business, why it was important that intangible piece rose all the way to the top, why it was so valuable. When I was a young leader, I met one of my heroes. His name is Father Gregory Boyle. I don't know if any of you are from LA or have heard of, Father G from Homeboys Industries has written several books. His very first book is called Tattoos on the Heart. I think it's his first one. It changed my life as a young leader, and I highly recommend people read it. In his book, Father G said, even gangs have a culture. Even gangs have a culture. And you might be sitting there going, duh, of course they have a culture. But I thought all of us would create businesses. Maybe we form this ESOP. We think everyone's going to want to work there. Everyone's going to love it. It's all going to be great all the time. And Father G was like, it does not work that way. People have personalities, and they have histories and experiences, and tools that maybe we've not all seen before. You have to nurture the good, he said, and eliminate the bad. And in order to eliminate it, you have to recognize it. And it was a really strong lesson for me as a young leader. And I decided that in order to nurture the good, I was going to create a culture of curiosity. I was going to start asking questions. Grandma be damned, I wanted to know who was sitting around me at the table and in the cubicle next to me and on the Zoom screen. My own story started with a lie, quite an audacious lie actually, and a layoff. I was driving down the GW Parkway one day, which is a major road that goes around Washington, D.C., on the way from the suburbs back to downtown. I had gotten to my office that day, and the general counsel was already sitting in my... Are there any general counsels in the audience? You don't favor well in my story, and I just feel like I need to apologize in advance. I've known many great ones. But I get to my office, I sit down, the general counsel's there. He said, we're out of business. We've spent all of the money. We're closing. He said, I want you to call the investors, apologize, pack your stuff, and get home. Basically, like, don't let the door hit you on the way out. And I'm like, I need to apologize? I didn't spend all of this money. What is this man talking about? For years, I had wanted to own my own business, and I would hitch my star to someone else's wagon, and that wagon would crash. Rinse and repeat. This was the tech boom and bust, and I wasn't unique. There was something special about Gina Schaefer. But I had always wanted to own my own business, and this is the situation I kept finding myself in. So here I am, arrived at work, call the investors, out of money, pack your stuff, go home. And I'm driving home, and I'm thinking to myself, oh my God, what am I going to tell my husband? I was a newlywed at the time. How am I going to tell him I don't have a job? I can't help pay the rent, the mortgage. And Mark really wasn't going to care so much if I didn't have a job. He was going to care if I wasn't busy. It scares the hell out of my husband if I don't have anything to do. Yes. So I start thinking about where I lived and the needs of my community. And I realized that I was sitting on a gold mine. I had moved in 1997 to this amazing community in Logan Circle, in Washington, D.C., called Logan Circle. Logan Circle had been destroyed by the riots when Martin Luther King was assassinated. Those riots started north of where my office is and spread south, down 14th Street, leaving in their wake sadness, despair. Everybody moved out. Old Victorian houses were boarded up. The businesses all left. There was nothing to see in Logan Circle. And in the late 80s, early 90s, decades later, people started moving back. They were moving, I don't know which way east is. They were moving east in Washington to try and find cheaper housing. And they were running smack dab into this neighborhood with these beautiful, almost beautiful, boarded up houses and this long abandoned commercial corridor just screaming with potential. I was one of those people. I thought, I'm gonna own a place before I get married for whatever reason. I started working with a real estate agent named Linda Hughes, and Linda took me around the city and she educated me on mortgages and interest rates and all of the things a young person should know about buying their first place. And she called me after one of our tours one day and she said, I figured it out. The only place you can afford is Logan Circle. It was so sad. 20 years later, I would write a book, and in that book, there's a chapter called There Are No Tears in Hardware, but you better believe there are tears when you buy a house in a neighborhood like Logan Circle. I would go to the association meetings, and we would joke that our toilet was always running, our pictures were on the ground, and we lived in the dark, because the closest hardware store was too far away. None of us wanted to get into our cars and drive to the suburbs to buy picture hangers and a flapper and light bulbs. Heck, most of us didn't even know what a flapper was at that point, let's be honest. So, we started talking about all of the things that we needed, and people used to say there were 3 things that they really wanted to have in our community. Every good community needs it. Think about where you live. Think about your main streets, what's important to you. A grocery store, a pharmacy, and a hardware store. So if that Excel spreadsheet was a checklist, we got a grocery store in 2001, check. A pharmacy next door, check, check. That left hardware. Why couldn't I go from software to hardware and take this intangible notion, people, me, and create something really useful for this neighborhood? I was so excited. I figured it out. I got home that day from that really lousy commute. I walked in the door, I slammed it, pictures shook. Mark came running out of the back room. He said, what is going on? And I said, I'm going to open a hardware store. And like a very good spouse, he didn't say a word. He always gets mad at me when I tell this story. He's like, I'm sure I said something. He's like indignant about it. I know I said something. So a lot of people don't know this. Javier does now because we talked about it last night. There are no national hardware franchises in the United States. You either join a co-op or you buy from a wholesaler, or you do some combination of the two. So I sent an email off to Ace Hardware, the largest national cooperative in the United States, and they sent a guy named Richard Mann to vet me. I always wish that I would be speaking to an audience and Richard would be in the back of the room and raise his hand. I don't remember what Richard looks like. This is why. Richard was supposed to make sure that I had a business experience and money in the bank. I was in a wonderful neighborhood that needed a hardware store, could support a hardware store, and that I had picked a really great location. Well, I already told you I had no money because I kept getting fired. I wasn't born in a hardware family. I didn't have that going for me, and business experience. Logan Circle was boarded up, entire blocks. In fact, my office right now, we've moved that first location. My office is next to a block called S Street, and every single house on S, when I opened my first location, every single house was boarded up. And so this is what Richard was seeing. And then let me tell you about 1416 P Street, my gem. Everybody's first baby is their favorite, right? 1416 P Street was 100 feet deep, 20 feet wide, no elevator, no loading dock, no parking, no. But you know what? Richard said yes. He loved it. He thought it was the best idea ever. I have no idea why, but he said, sign a lease, fax your application back to Ace Hardware, and you will be on your way to business ownership. Oh, and I forgot to tell you that the building also had broken windows and 100 pigeons living on the second floor. Swear to God. So I did. I signed a $1.9 million lease with this guy named Jim Abdo, who owned the building. I faxed the application back to Ace, excuse me, and I went home. I skipped the whole way home. I was so excited. And about 2 minutes later, this is where the GC comes in again, I'm so sorry. The general counsel from Ace Hardware called me. Richard had lied. You see, they couldn't decide what was harder to believe. A woman opening a hardware store in a neighborhood like Logan Circle, or a woman opening, you saw that line, right? They were completely panicked. I'm going to pause for a second and say that Ace is an amazing partner, and I feel really bad that I have to throw him under the bus, but this is a very, very true story. So, Richard was fired that day. That's why I always wish that I will meet him at a conference, because I never, ever saw him again. He was fired, I had a legally binding lease, and so I got to open my very first hardware store. Yeah, 2003, true story. Fast forward to today, we have 13 locations, almost 300 teammates, a 2-year-old ESOP that we're super proud of, and no intentions of stopping anytime soon. Well, that wasn't a shameless plug for clapping, but thank you. When the team from NCEO asked me to come and talk, I said, I can't talk about ESOPs. I'm a baby, right? I do this when I talk about mine, like it's this silly little bird that I have to protect. They're like, no, you don't have to talk about ESOPs. Talk about how you built such a strong culture, your teams. How did you grow? How did you grow in urban areas with such a random start? And so I said, okay, I'm the tool lady. I can talk about the tools that we had to build a corporate culture all day long, and nobody can laugh at me for being cheesy. Do not laugh. So my first story started out a little not so rocky, not so unrocky. And so I wanted to be able to talk about that neighborhood and what a co-op was going to do, a co-op that is now an ESOP did, to bring that neighborhood back to life, to help regenerate and help rebuild. And think about how cool it is that the people that helped me start that first location are now owners in that ESOP, in that community. It's like the best story ever. So I wanted to tell stories, and you can't tell stories unless you're curious. So that was tool number one. I hired a guy named Skippy once. It's kind of a funny name for this dude, but he walked into my office. He had one of those ankle bracelets, court-ordered ankle bracelets around his ankle. He was on house arrest. Yes. Skippy sat down in front of me. He looked a little forlorn, and he said, "No one will give me a job." Okay. I'm really thinking about Father G and Homeboy when I meet Skippy, because I know that I have to draw on some seriously strong resources. He said, "My landlord still wants to get paid. I've been on house arrest for a year because the courts won't give me a court date." But he said, "My landlord still wants to get paid. My phone company, oddly enough, keeps sending me a phone bill, and they want me to pay them. But no one will give me a job." If you wonder why people commit crime again, which I know is a whole other topic of conversation, you need to talk to Skippy about it. And I said, "Okay, I think I can give you a job. But first, I want to talk about your jewelry. What's going on down there?" And we spent the next hour talking about hopes and dreams and childhood, loves and loss, previous careers, selling drugs, selling hardware, and interestingly enough, finding some overlap. Enough overlap that I thought his story needed to become part of ours. There was something there. Now, I have been called every name imaginable since hiring Skippy. I've been told I was stupid, I was crazy, I was a nut job. I've heard it all. So you can say whatever you want about this new hire on my team. But Skippy went on to work for us for 10 years. He became a sales associate and then a paint expert and assistant manager until eventually managing our busiest location. I like to say that he actually broke our bonus system, because the first year he became a manager, sales went up so high that we had to pay him more than we paid all the other managers combined. It was crazy. I think he was a little money-driven. It worked. In my book, Recovery Hardware, I talk about non-traditional teachers, people like Mike who have taught me something that you'd least expect to learn a life lesson, maybe from somebody like Mike or somebody like Skippy. There were 3 that Skippy taught me that resonate, that he and I used to infuse into our culture in a variety of different ways. The first was that he was very good with money. I already said that, like cold hard cash. He could count it, save it, and buy inventory with it. I bet some of you need someone on your team like that. Number 2, he was very good at working odd hours. His bracelet was like a GPS, a radio frequency, and a Big Brother all rolled into one. He had a curfew, so he would get home at a certain time at night. His leg would beep. Somebody from the courthouse would call him because they had to prove that it was him locked into the house. And he wasn't allowed out the next morning until it beeped again. Big deal, right? That's how house arrest works. But when he was allowed out, he was allowed to go to 3 places. He could go to church, an NA meeting, Narcotics Anonymous meeting, or he could go to his job. And you know what all three of those places have in common? Community, culture, support. All of the things that he needed to become healthy again. All of the things we were trying to infuse into this neighborhood that had fallen apart, that needed love. Long before we were expected to meet customers where they are 24 hours a day, Skippy's previous customers taught him that they didn't just want him to be there between 9 and 5. They wanted him to be there all the time. And as a non-traditional teacher, he taught us that. And third, probably the most important, is that he taught us how to deal with difficult customers. It is not fair to make fun of his previous customers, but he started it, so I'm allowed to finish it. They did not come see him when they were in a good mood. They did not come see him when they were on their best behavior. They came to see him all the time and not happy. How many times have you gone to the hardware store because your plumbing is leaking and flooding your bathroom and somebody in your house is freaking out? How many times have you gone to the hardware store because you're having a barbecue and you realize you're out of briquettes or there are ants all over your countertop? You are not happy when this happens. Skippy took his previous customer experience and related it to the hardware world, and he taught us how to turn those folks into raving fans. We could make fun of it all we want, but there was a curiosity that came from all of us knowing him that we cultivated and got to know his story, which created a more transparent workplace, which made things grow, which made this new associate of mine, this new manager of mine, break the bonus system. Who doesn't want that to happen? Does anybody know the second half of the expression, curiosity killed the cat? Anybody? Yes, thank you so much. Are you the only person that knew that? Maybe? My husband thought it was so strange that I didn't know there was a second half. So this is what I'm thinking. My grandmother, okay, so if you didn't hear him, curiosity killed the cat, but satisfaction brought it back. My grandmother had me believing for years that asking questions was a negative, that I was nosy, when in fact a truncated proverb, it was truncated centuries ago, had all of us believing that we were killing cute little fuzzy animals by asking our neighbors how they feel, by asking people like Skippy, hey dude, why you got that ankle bracelet on? It was an old proverb that we all needed to be reminded of. Imagine if Tesla or Curry or Edison believed that truncated proverb and they didn't create, they didn't invent, they didn't explore, they weren't interested in the world around them. I was thinking about what we don't have. So first of all, we might not have some of the companies in this room, which I think would be a tragedy. We wouldn't have popcorn. Imagine if somebody hadn't decided to throw dry corn kernels into a fire and create the most amazing snack on the face of the planet. That's what would have happened if we believed that stupid proverb. I'm sticking with it. But the point is, I think that curiosity is a great equalizer. No matter your title at work, your age, your gender, your race, we all have the ability to be curious in the people that we work with. I realized that if I was going to hire people, I should be a little curious about them because then maybe in turn they would be curious about the people they worked with. And in my case, the 25,000 items on our shelf. Maybe? There's a stereotype about Washingtonians, and I feel like this is a dangerous territory because I might come up with some more stereotypes from all of you in the audience. But the stereotype is this, the one that I'm thinking of anyway, is that the first thing we ask somebody when we meet them is, what do you do for a living? Has a negative connotation. It means I want to suss out your sphere of influence or your net worth. But you know what? I have met the most interesting people by using that as my jumping off point. People get so afraid, they hear grandma, what do I ask, what do I say? But I've met hobbyists and lobbyists, philanthropists, moms, teachers, politicians, a formerly homeless man, and a drug dealer. My life changed by using that as a jumping off point. Researchers have shown or proven that dopamine, which is the brain's pleasure chemical, is intricately linked to our curiosity state, meaning the more curious we are in people around us, and the more curious we satisfy that, the more we satisfy that curiosity, the more our brain floods our body with dopamine and the happier we are. Don't we all want to live in that state? You're like, no, not interested. Don't you want to go to work with people whose bodies are filled with dopamine, who are so excited to talk to you and hear your story and know what tools you have that might not be the traditional kinds of tools, like Mike and his tennis shoes? Think of the things that we learn, the ways we can grow, the cultures that we can build, the strength of that culture at our workplaces by being curious. Once you have the stories, though, you have to have the language, and words matter. Depending on your Google search, you can have anywhere between 170,000 and 250,000 words in the English language. It's a lot of words. I mean, most of us probably know, 1,000 of them, 2,000 of them? But how we arrange those words matter. And going back to Father G's analogy, the way we nurture the good ones and eliminate the bad ones also matters. How many of you have a favorite 4-letter word, 5-letter word phrase, like a curse word? Yeah, most of us, right? Thank you, Steve. All right. Do any of you say watered off? How about my guy that knew the second half of the... My mother says watered off because she thinks the real phrase is offensive. So I'm from Ohio, northeastern Ohio. My very beefy Midwestern dad and brother also say watered off so they don't water off my mother. It's the dumbest thing I've ever seen. But I want you to close your eyes for a second, and in your brain, I want you to say, don't say it out loud because we can't get kicked out today. I want you to say your 3 or 4-letter word or phrase a couple times, just in your head. And I want you to think about what you're doing when you say it. Are you high-fiving the guy next to you? Are you kicking the door to your office? Are you scowling? Are you cheering? Are you being flooded with dopamine? Open your eyes. I say this because for 14 years, I realized I had turned a very innocuous 4-letter word into a curse word. That 4-letter word was being used to describe my profession, my role, my hobbies, and it went like this. Hi, I'm Gina. I'm just a hardware store owner. Hi, I'm Gina. I just sell hardware. Hi, I just make greeting cards. I won't throw him under the bus, a gentleman in the room today who said, I just do the legal aspects of an ESOP. Whoa, not just. But I bet you didn't hear it when you said it, right? You are so important in the whole transaction. I knew that if I was saying it about myself, perhaps my team was hearing the words the same way. So Brett is my director of HR. He's here today. What if I said, hey, have you met Brett? He's just my HR director. Have y'all met Jamie? She just organized this conference. Lante is just the cashier at my hardware store. Imagine if I walked into the office every day and I introduced people that way. I didn't want to use that word. I didn't care so much if I was using it about myself, but I certainly didn't want my team to think I was using it about them. So flip the narrative. Hey, have you met Brett? He's the most fantastic HR manager I've ever met. Have you met Jamie? She's the best conference organizer ever. And that Lante, man, he's the fastest cashier I've ever seen. It works. You can feel it. One little word. But how do you know what those words are if you don't ask, if you don't survey the people that you're with? I literally locked. This is probably illegal now. This was a while ago. But I locked about 8 people from my team, including Skippy, in a conference room. And I said, we're not leaving this room until we figure out what kinds of words we want to define us, what kinds of things we want people to say about us. And I took a good cross-section because I think the challenge we have, you're leaders in this room, and you feel like the pressure is on you. You have to make everyone understand what the ESOP means and how to infuse it in your culture and make people want to stay and reduce turnover and all of those things. But I think that it's a team sport. I think it requires everybody to participate. So I locked these people in the room, Skippy, the CFO, a delivery driver, a cashier, a couple store associates, and I said, we have about 20 minutes. I want you to yell out, write down, whatever, all of the negative words that are associated with our business. It's pretty scary as a leader to do this. If there are founders in the room, if you want to ask your team to do this, I might recommend that you don't sit in the room when it happens. But I wanted everyone to feel comfortable. And so for like 20 minutes, and they were honest. I mean, we had built a culture of honesty. And so they shouted the words that they thought were associated with us. And for this particular speech, I'm going to say we took those words and we moved them. We put them aside for a while. It ended up becoming a 6-month exercise in eliminating those words from our vocabulary. And it might have meant eliminating those words from Yelp reviews or hiring practices or orientation sessions. But we took them away. We worked on taking them away. And then on the other whiteboard, the other side, were all of the positives. What are the things that you think are associated with our business? What do you want people to say about us? What do they say about us that we love? And the result were the core values that infuse the language that we want to hear every single day, embodies the language we want to be every single day. Now, I'm not going to ask you to raise your hands if you have core values. Most companies do. But when I worked in the tech industry, we would put core values on page 17 of the website and 34 of the handbook, and then we'd never look at them again. Like go in a drawer. We don't have to see that stuff. We did it. It was a marketing exercise. I wanted them to be infused in our hiring and our counseling and our training and our firing, all the ings. What were we going to do with these words? And it really came to light one day when a little kid, shouldn't call him a little kid, a 14-year-old, walked into my office and asked me for a job. I didn't even know if I legally was allowed to hire a 14-year-old. But he came with a mentor, and the mentor did all of the talking. No matter how hard I tried, I could not be scary to Eddie, who was the 14-year-old. And I should tell you that in that original location, the office was an elevator shaft, and there was no door, and there were mice living in the corner. We were so professional. I had no reason to think that he was going to be any more polished than we were. So I dug deep. I wanted to see something in this kid. I wanted to be the nice first boss he ever had. And so I pulled the words from the core values, and I said, Eddie, tell me about a time you were a good neighbor. And I actually directed the question at the mentor, because I'm like, this kid's not going to answer. And he lit up like a firecracker. I could see him out of the corner of my eye. Eddie may have never had a boss or a paycheck or a team, but he had a Mrs. Robinson that lived next door, and he watered her plants, fed her cat, carried her groceries, all of the things that a good neighbor does. It was like the core value coming to life. So I hired Eddie, and for the next 10 years, I realized Skippy worked for me for 10 years, so did Eddie, I'm not making this up. For the next 10 years, he gained his confidence, he found his voice. He was a good neighbor to every single customer that walked into the store, until he finally left us to go to college, kind of like a fully baked young man. He was fantastic. All because I had the wherewithal to say, hey, tell me about a time you were a good neighbor. Language matters. So you're building stories, you're using the right language. How do you infuse them in the entire organization? How does it become important to everybody, not just the leaders or not just HR or not just the committee, the culture committee, depending on who is trying to create the ethos of the ESOP within your organizations? I was standing in the middle of Logan Hardware one day with this very distraught woman in front of me. Now, the one thing ACE didn't take into consideration when they thought that it was a bad neighborhood to open up a hardware store was the fact that when you take the boards off of old Victorians, you want to seal the windows and paint the walls and change the faucets and fix the flapper and all of the things that all of you do all the time in a hardware store. Of course, our neighbors wanted to do that. So they were coming in droves. They were super, super supportive. Thank gosh, because I had no idea what I was doing. But this lady was standing in front of me, and she was very distraught, and I just explained to her 2 times how to use this drill. She wanted to hang some things in her new condo, and she didn't get it. And I was explaining it to her in theory. Now, if those of you in the room lived through this, there was a time before YouTube. We could not open a video in the middle of the hardware store and say, hey, this will show you how to use your drill. So it's like my inner teacher. I start thinking about this boss that I used to have. Much like Linda, that real estate agent, my boss, Connie, is one of the smartest women I ever know. Connie could sell anything to anyone, and I had nicknamed her Quabs, Queen of BS. We're not going to curse. Queen of BS. So in my head, I'm thinking, I'm going to channel Quabs. Quabs had figured out how to bill me to IBM Latin America before I knew how to turn on a computer, and to me, that was magic. Like, if she could convince them to hire me, she could do anything. So I'm thinking, I'm going to do it. What would Connie do, right? WWCD. I take the drill from the young woman, I plug it into the wall, I open the chuck, I insert the drill bit, I close the chuck, and I drilled a hole right into the side of Logan Hardware. Oh my God, I'm jumping up and down, I'm high-fiving Quabs, I'm singing. Of course I wasn't, because I was calm, cool, and collected. I needed this customer to think I had done this 1,000,000 times. I had never used a drill in my life. If somebody wants to call Richard Mann and tell him that Ace was onto something when they told me I couldn't open a hardware store, they were onto something. So I was very calm. I realized in that moment that I needed to make sure that my team didn't have the same experience. I needed to make sure that when that customer expected me to know what I was doing, I knew what I was doing. I wasn't making it up. And of course, I was also thinking, there's 24,999 other things in this hardware store now that I need to figure out what to do with. This lady only got me to use one. What am I going to do about the rest of them? So you can fake it till you make it for so long, but if you want your team to be involved, you have to have tools that they can use, no pun intended, to make their lives easier. I was elected to the Ace Hardware Board of Directors at one point, and I was not ready. Like, it's a multi-billion-dollar company. I was too young. I was inexperienced. I was all of the things. But when an opportunity like that comes along, you don't say no. I may have never gotten that opportunity again. And I would fly in and out of O'Hare Airport. Ace is located in Oak Brook, Illinois. I met some great folks here from Oak Brook today. I would fly in and out of O'Hare, and I would go to those meetings, and the first couple went something like this. If I had a chair, I would sit down and be sitting on my hands, and I would just be like completely mute. I was Eddie. I couldn't say a word. I was scared to death that I was going to say the wrong thing. And then I went to the next 3 or 4 meetings, and I had found my voice, and I would talk. And then I would leave thinking, I said the exact opposite of what I should have, or no one believed me, or I didn't say the right thing. I had such imposter syndrome, which is an expression I absolutely hate, but I was really afraid I had not made my point. And if you can picture this with me like a movie set, I like to sit by the window seat. And so I would enter the airplane, and I would scooch over to the window, and I would raise the shade, and I would look out on the tarmac. And about the 6th or 7th meeting, I entered the airplane, I scooched over, I raised the shade, and there was an airplane out on the tarmac on fire. I completely panicked, like grabbed the armrest, hair raised, and thank goodness, like 2 seconds later, a very friendly flight attendant came over the loudspeaker and said, "It's just an exercise, I must have been in 7E, and she's like, the lady in 7E is gonna have a meltdown. It's just an exercise." My term on that board was 9 years. So for 9 years, I went in and out of O'Hare Airport. For 9 years, I saw that exercise. And I thought, the universe is trying to tell me that I'm going up in flames, that I have no idea what I'm doing. It was a metaphor for all of my hardware failure, all of my board service failure, whatever. It was a metaphor for everything. And on that very last meeting, I said, I'm not going back to O'Hare Airport. It took me years before I would fly through Chicago again. I was scarred. I said, I'm going to take the train. So I took the train from Chicago to Washington, D.C., 17 hours. If any of you like riding the rails, it was an amazing experience. I had 17 hours to reflect. I had 17 hours to think about that board service and the flames and everything I was trying to do to build this really strong company. And it finally occurred to me that we needed to practice. It sounds so simple, but those firefighters knew exactly what they were doing. They were able to do that exercise over and over and over again because they practiced. They gave their teams the tools they needed. They utilized the non-traditional tools that came from their team members. They had metrics and ways that they put fires out. And I needed to infuse that kind of responsibility, that kind of ethos in the business that I was building. I was so grateful for those firefighters, and I was so glad that I had that epiphany and didn't go back to my business eventually thinking that I was, going to blow up Logan Circle again, because it had come back and it was so great. Building a culture is a contact sport. You need to make contact with the people around you. You need to be curious about them. You need to figure out what the stories are that your company can sell, your company can build and tell, using the right language, and then infusing it over and over and over again, not page 17 of a website and 34 of a handbook, not stuffing things in a drawer and expecting us all to do it by osmosis. It took me a long time to figure all of that out. So the 3 tools that we really have used over and over again was curiosity, creating the language, eliminating the bad, nurturing the good, and then practice, infusing it into your organization. All of the things that you're learning today about how to make our teammates, our co-owners, understand the ESOP and get excited about it, it's not a one and done. You know that, right? That's probably the first thing I learned. I said I don't know anything about ESOPs yet. One of the first things I learned was that it's not a one and done. So I want to leave you, if we can put it up on screen, I want to leave you with a picture of Mike. Sorry, where'd we go? Because we started out with Mike, and I think it's a good full circle to think about where Logan Circle was, what it's become. This man is so dear to me. Mike retired after being in the ESOP for 2 years, so he left fully vested. He left with money he never expected to have. He left with the park bench in his past, with a team that loved him, customers that adored him, and with an understanding that you could be something bigger if people ask you questions and they're curious about your life and they care about where you've been and they recognize the tools that you have that might be different than someone else's. I would challenge you to go back to your offices and figure out who the mics are. Now, it might not be as provocative as this story, but who are the mics? What are your tennis shoes? What can you do with them? Thanks.